Hello and welcome to the 269th New Social Environment. I'm Malva Kajali, the events assistant here at the Rail, and today I have the pleasure and privilege of welcoming photographer, artist, and all-around luminary Carrie Mae Weems in conversation with Paul D. Miller, aka DJ Spooky. We're also so lucky to have the poet Joy Priest here with us today, who will read to close today's program. We've started out all of our events here with two important acknowledgements. The first is that here in New York, we're on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and the Shinnecock Indian Nation. The second is an acknowledgement that Black Lives Matter. Although we have for many of our events named many of those who have lost their lives to police violence in the last year alone, I'd like to dedicate today's program to Breonna Taylor, who was murdered in her sleep by police just over a year ago on March 13th under the modern-day equivalent of the slave-era jump warrant, and as we found out in the past year, in anticipation of the city of Louisville's multi-million-dollar redevelopment plan for the area in which she lived. I think it's worth reminding ourselves of these facts that, as we mourn her death, we're also reminded that both of these acknowledgements are sort of aligned and that they flow from the same extractive logics of white settler expansion and colonialism on which this country was built. I encourage you all to check out the chat for a living document of resources and actions that we've been sort of putting together as we do our part in the learning and unlearning required to undo these legacies of injustice. But now it's my honor to introduce our guests today. We're joined by Carrie Mae Weems, who's widely renowned as one of the most influential contemporary American artists living today. Over the course of nearly 4 decades, she's developed a complex body of work employing text, fabric, audio, digital images, installation, video, and I would add in lived experiences. But she is most celebrated as a photographer, and she'll be joined by Paul D. Miller, aka our favorite spooky DJ, who is a composer, multimedia artist, writer, and brilliant conversationalist whose work traverses the blend of global cultures, genres, and environmental and social issues. Paul and Carrie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right. Hey.
Hello.
Yo. So here we are in cyberspace, and it's an absolute pleasure to see Carrie's beaming face coming out of my computer monitor here. Malvika, thank you as always for such a wonderful introduction. And of course, Fong, good to see you. And to the audience, I just want to say I'm happy everyone's tuning in and hope everyone is staying safe in these very turbulent and abstract times. So here we are, Carrie. We've known each other now for, a significant amount of time. And one of the things that's always struck me about your work, and I just want to use this as by way of a preface to the audience, is that to me, at least, there's always been this really lyrical sensibility that underlies your work, looking at both autobiographical, both fictional characters, personae, and also there's kind of a lyricism that is implicit in how you think about, when I look at your photography and then see how it manifests in other formats. You recently just did a series of pieces with Duke University about COVID, for example. And then, of course, you most recently in New York, you were at MoMA. That's probably a broad brushstroke there, but I would love to hear how do you get started? When you wake up in the morning, are you like, I'm going to exist in this sort of poly-dimensional situation here and then distill it to photographs, or because it's hard to kind of pin your work into one zone. That's what I mean. It's like photography is a dimensional process with you. At least that's my personal impression. Mm-hmm. So do you want to riff for a second on that? Like how you document your process, because the part of the process becomes the work.
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think, I think my process is really anchored in a lot of it's really anchored like in music. I start almost every day, and I have for any number of years, but in the more recent years, in the last maybe 8 or 9 years, I starred every morning with Ode to Life by Don Pullen. And then I listen, so I have this very, very particular playlist. And then that's followed by Stevie Wonder's Love's in Need of Love Today, which I always dance to and I move to. That's followed by Marley's Could It Be Love? That's followed by the World Saxophone Quartet, Dear Lord. That's followed by Phil Saunders, Gotta Be Free. That is like, that is like my 35-minute wake up. And the way that I sort of think about my life, it's the way that I think about what concerns me. It's the thing that gives me a kind of solace and an anchoring, these sort of deep sounds made by extraordinary artists. And so other artists have always been very, very important to me. And musicians probably at the sort of the top of the list. And of course, there's Louis Armstrong as well. In the afternoon, I pay more attention to people like Frank Ocean and Alice Coltrane in sort of a combination. And so it's interesting that you kind of talk about sort of lyricism, because I've come to understand that in a lot of ways that I sing my words, that I'm interested in, even though I'm not a singer by a long stretch of the imagination. I can't sing a lick of all but I love but I do sing my words. I think it's just a part of my natural makeup. It's where I come from. And I think it's also about kind of the nature of influence. And so I'm interested in these sort of forms. I think probably more than anything, I'm simply deeply curious, and I'm curious about how to manage my sort of complicated thinking, or my simple thinking with the complicated world around me, and how to sort of bring those things into concert with one another. And work takes a long time, I mean, there are certain things that are like, very fast, like the coming of, like a flash of spirit, a flash of inspiration. And then it's the working out, it's like the detail of paying attention to the detail and paying attention to the meaning of what it is that you're trying to get at, And then, the form, will it be an image text piece? Will it be a still piece? Will it be photographs? Will it be video? Will it be performance? Would it be poetry? Not like joy, but and that's sort of the way that I use words and language. And so it's difficult. It's a difficult process, because I think probably, and maybe you probably feel the same way too, there's a sort of constant, birthing of the new, right? And in that process, there is, that sort of struggle with self, and struggle with ideas, and struggle with your own purpose, and struggle with meaning. And so I take the work seriously, and the work takes me seriously, even though I try to play a lot at the same time, because I think that that's an important part of me as well, leaving lots of room for ideas of play.
So let's unpack that, because play and you also have a very irreverent sensibility. I remember when we first met at the Atlantic Center for the Arts down in Florida. You're speaking of morning, like I'm drinking green tea, matcha, you're drinking lapsang. We all, have this sort of, spicy moments there. And so it was a funny moment. I woke up and Carrie happened to be in the room, and it was kind of one of those funny moments where
I just crawled into bed with you.
So
I thought that was absolutely appropriate.
Well, it was one of those moments where I was like, is this art, or am I just waking up here? And it's it was and it's one of those moments where you have interdisciplinary artists, as we like to call everything these days. So there's different modalities of the personal and the notion of how kind of social space, which is what the series is about, have merged. So I was, as a male, I'm sure we have many men in the audience, waking up with a strange woman in your bed, beaming down at you. Many things might go through your mind, I'll just leave it at that. So you're kind of like, wait, kind of like, I hope I didn't do anything. Like, in a way that was
No,
like,
I think that,
yeah.
I was just telling a few of our colleagues that are online that we met just right around 9/11.
Mhm.
9/11, we were supposed to be there actually. Just maybe we were planning to fly that day or the next day when 9/11 happened. So that was 20 years ago. That's
Yeah.
how long ago we met at the Atlantic Center for the Arts. Saul Williams was there also, the great poet was there, Paul and myself. And then of course there were younger artists, and we were quote the mentors of these younger artists. But but I knew that I wanted to really get close to you, not not in a
Well,
you know
I'm deeply honored, but like in a funny way, I really want to unpack this notion of personal space and storytelling and narrative, because a lot of the way that when I hear you think, I can hear the dots being connected in such a powerful way that video and motion of like movement, and you're coming out of this idea of the still life, and then kind of when these issues pop up, like, yeah, when we were like talking at the Atlantic Center for the Arts, for example, Saul would read a poem, you would be doing stuff where you were getting your students to rethink about like narrative and storytelling. I was trying to get people to sort of deal with the idea of collage and its place in the acoustic everyday world, like the idea of an acoustic portrait. And when you start to think about Saul's poetry or your kind of photography that lends itself to that kind of photography in motion, as we call film, you have always had this sort of, it's like an essayist. Like when I think of like Bin Okri, or when I think of, there's so many amazing writers where there's that sense of how the page unfolds. Your work, it's like the novel is not written, but the story is there. And so because like I remember once you did a series where recently, for example, just to continue to more current work, and sorry to just jump because I know time is ticking here and I want to be very respectful of time. Let's talk about your Duke University material as well, because that was speaking of 9/11, we're still at war. I remember, we were talking about the process leading up to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, but now we're in a different kind of pandemic motion of war and propaganda as well, which is this idea of we're not only in a biological pandemic, but we're in an information pandemic where people are being manipulated, QAnon, the insurrection of January 6th, and they have this sort of mental fever dream. But for your work, the COVID process at Duke was really fascinating. And I'd love to maybe if you could unpack that a little bit, because it's called Stand Against COVID. And I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Oh,
sorry
sure.
to give a big preface there, but it just.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I mean, it's, you talk about sort of process and you talk about play. There's a really wonderful Alvolution folk saying that within seriousness, there's very little room for play. But within play, there's tremendous room for seriousness. And I use this and I think about it often as a kind of weave and a metaphor through my thinking and through my work. It's often either in sort of profound conversation with myself and or with my colleagues, my close friends, you, my dear friend Pierre Loving. We were just entering the lockdown when just at that moment, it was like March 3rd or 5th or something. And I thought, oh, wow, this is kind of serious, right? I mean, we've never experienced a pandemic. I don't know what this thing really is, but I do know that Black people are probably going to be really impacted by this.
Mm-hmm.
Brown people are going to be impacted by this because they are frontline workers and because they are also isolated. There are a whole series of questions, socially disadvantaged. This is going to matter. And then the next day, there was a report out of Chicago about the number of deaths. Even at that early stage, just a few weeks in, right, 82% of the people who had died of COVID in Chicago for Black and Latino Americans, right? 84% in St. Louis, 72% in Memphis. I mean, like already the numbers were staggering. It was staggering, right? I thought, okay,
Yes.
we have to deal with this. We have to deal with this. And within 24 hours, after being on the phone with my best friend, kind of unpacking this information, thinking about it and thinking about its meaning, knowing that something had to be done, knowing that I wanted to have some kind of a dialogue with my community around it, I immediately started developing a series of text pieces and visual pieces that that really served as a kind of artist-driven public awareness campaign about the devastating effects of COVID on Black bodies, Black and brown bodies, and of course, Native American bodies as well. And of course, you know, the attacks on Asians. All of that stuff, I was like very much aware of very quickly. And so I started this project. And now the project has moved on to, I've spent the entire last year working on this COVID project. It's called Take 6. With the idea that Take 6 is of course, the social distance that's necessary to maintain a level of safety, and just developing a series of systematic strategies that could be used in and out and around these various communities and neighborhoods. And it's been really kind of remarkable. So we're now in maybe 25 cities around the country. We're in Austria, in South Africa, in London, and in several other European cities as well. They've taken the project, and we continue to expand here in the United States. And then most recently, I've sort of shifted, you know, my focus to, of course, the vaccine, understanding that again, amongst people of color, there is hesitancy and a resistance to taking the vaccine. So how do I start to sort of talk about that and use that material and use this language in the unpacking of the levels of distrust and discomfort that Black people have historically felt in relationship to the system, to the government in particular, that has you know, systematically oppressed it and trespassed against it. So there's very little trust within the Black community around this vaccine. And so I'm just sort of looking at all of this, Paul, right now, and really trying to figure it out, and figuring it out as I go. Sometimes I construct a language, then I realize that it needs to like sort of shift. You know, like what's the difference between sort of talking about, you know, inequity and inequality? Right, you know, like really like sort of slicing and dicing like the meaning of those terms in relationship to this pandemic that I might want to share. So as I go along, I've sort of changed language here and there, bending it to its more precise meaning. So it's been an amazing time, and I didn't know how much I needed this to do this work. I needed to do this work as much as I needed to get the word out, right? That it was also grounding for me and meaningful for me to be working in this very particular way around one of the worst things that we've experienced really in our lifetime. And then that, of course, coupled with George Floyd, to have that moment, right? So not only are we dealing with sort of this sort of extraordinary biological moment, where we are all facing sort of an international pandemic, but we're also dealing with this extraordinary death of George Floyd and the uprising, the protest, the demonstrations that happened around the world in response, finally, to the killing of this man. And thank you for bringing up Breonna Taylor, who died, of course, just right around the same time. So it's really sort of an amazing moment for a lot of reasons around what we have to unpack, what we're looking at in terms of making, being, doing, and living.
Well, when you say living, I mean, one of the beautiful things that I've always noticed as a consistent theme in your work is that kind of life affirmation. There are some artists, like if you look at Eugene Atget, I'm never sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, the French photographer who was doing sort of architectural mise en scene. And then if you fast forward to a couple other photographers where it feels very specifically like photography has been both removed from life, but then it's been used to kind of frame life. What you were doing with the Take Six material and the way that that's toured was amazing, but also some of the work that was just on show at MoMA. And I'd love to unpack some of that as well, because there's some dots that could be connected between that sensibility, both with, I mean, one my favorite phrase of 2016 to about to 2020 was "I can't breathe." And you know, we had huge forest fires. There was a climate impact because of the massive amounts of sheer. If you were in California, the sky looked like a science fiction film. And again, me and you hang out in Aspen, and in Aspen, the sky was all ash, just come raining down because of the forest fires. So there was both a climate and a racial justice movement last summer. And your work kind of, again, sort of had a nice dialogue and also sort of a dance with that in a certain sense. Would you want to unpack some of the stuff that was because if we look at the COVID material and then sort of pivot to the stuff at MoMA, the consistent theme there is that kind of essayist approach. Do you want to unpack that a little bit? Or because the MoMA stuff, I think, just went down, right? Or is it still, if just for people, if you haven't seen it, there's plenty of documentation online.
It's the piece that you're referring to at MoMA is a project that I made probably 35, 30 years ago.
Mhm.
It's called From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried. That's the piece that you're referring to.
Yeah.
I saw what happened and I cried, which is an appropriation, actually. It uses appropriated images of a number of some famous and some not so famous photographers in order to really sort of think about not only the Black subject, but really about American history and the role of photography in playing out American history as it relates very specifically to Black people as photographic subjects, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just this sort of complicated, this is really complicated piece. I really love this piece. I really love the language, the way the language functions. And in a lot of ways, I think the piece is really much larger than myself. I think often work that is profound and deep is usually much larger than the artist who actually made it. You know, you start to almost function as a kind of conduit for something. But it seems to me, Paul, not unlike you, that my interests are, my interest in being a human is broad, right? Like I cannot separate, you know, the environment in nature from myself, so that if I am being honest and true, if I'm looking, if I'm digging deep, then what I see around me is simply a reflection of me, and vice versa, right? You know, that I am nature. And so what's happening with the environment, what's happening in culture, what's happening socially, what's happening politically, what's happening in pop culture, you know, what's happening, you know, around sort of, you know, issues of colonization, what's happening around issues of race, what's happening around issues of gender. How do you sort of really, you know, what is your moral compass? Where do you stand in relationship to the thing? And I think that is ultimately the work. And you spend your life unpacking your suitcase, right? You spend your life unpacking. You know,
that's a great. I'm gonna have to remember that. But sorry to pivot again, because what you were just saying, like the MoMA thing was kind of a tribute to you, and you had Wynton Marsalis and the Lincoln Center or Jazz Orchestra play. There was Sarah Lewis added. I mean, so there was a musical. That's what I'm saying. That's that multi-dimensional kind of context. And so Wynton and the Lincoln, just for the audience, it was kind of like a tribute to her that was virtual because obviously the pandemic. And I always glitch on the titles. From Here I Saw and I Cried, or
yes, From Here I Saw What Happened.
Okay. So there was a kind of a jazz component with the video component, and then a kind of critique of the way photography has now become more and more, in the era of social media and the era of ubiquitous photography, where everyone has a phone on their camera, we document the everyday process in a way that one could argue would be almost unimaginable because the sheer volume of data that we use several years ago. I mean, we're consuming data. Your cell phone, your average American consumes gigabytes of data every couple of weeks,
Yes.
Hundreds of gigabytes.
Yes.
So when the reason I brought that up is the MoMA piece, because it was partly a physical exhibition and partly this sort of meditation on overview of your work. So my apologies if I got the title slightly, it's a long.
Okay, it's okay. I forget them too.
Yeah. But all right. So I know we're getting on the cusp of 1:30, and I just want to
I can go longer. I just meant that I could stay on for an hour. I am here.
Okay, cool.
Yes, I'm here. Yes. I just no, I mean I think that no, that was it was sort of incredible. I mean, to have this panel that was organized by MoMA and Sarah Lewis, inviting Marcellus and a few other people to speak about the work and about the nature of my own influence, which is sort of wonderful. But I'm always really thinking about the work. Well, of course, I have like an enormous ego. It's gigantic, my
well,
head,
as you should, right?
it fills the screen, right? It's huge. But I also have the ability, fortunately, to place it on the side, to sort of disassociate, which I think you sort of have to do your work, to maintain a level of humility in relationship to the demands of the work. And so, the thing that I've come to realize is that I believe that for the most part, we do have a set of questions that we attempt to answer over the course of our lives. That I feel as though I've had the same question as a 13-year-old and as an 18-year-old as I do as a 68-year-old. The only difference is that I have the ability to articulate things differently than when I was a child. But the feelings, the ideas, the aspiration, the search for my deepest humanity was already in play as a child. I can remember sitting by myself, sitting on the back porch, weeping, trying to understand something about this life that I found myself in. I found it so extraordinary and overwhelming, right? I thought that maybe I would be an astronomer originally. And then I thought that I would be a geneticist because I love genetics as well. How do we come to be here? And why are we made up in the way that we are made? And I think that this work, these ideas, this interest sort of follows me. It follows me from place to place to place, and from work to work to work, and from project to project to project. Every project is essentially the same. It simply sounds different, right? It simply looks different, but the issues that are at play are persistent. And I think that then, this idea about the persistence of vision, the persistence of an idea, persistence of a moral compass, the persistence of digging is the thing that then is in your suitcase.
Right. Well, the suitcase metaphor is a perfect, because you travel quite a bit, but you also go back upstate. I remember that was a thing. Like that's your place, your place of peace, And amusingly enough, there's certain films where I chuckle about the way, like Jordan Peele's, Get Out, where they have the sunken place. You're in the. That one was always, I keep thinking about certain individuals in the Trump administration, or certain, Ben Carson, for example, in the sunken place. But, where it's just like, I don't know if the audience has seen that film, but this notion of Black surrealism has come into play on a lot of major film right now. Obviously, Black Panther being the most famous. And then, Jordan Peele, of course, Steve McQueen, a whole bunch of, so in the wake of what you've been doing with making these interdisciplinary places between photography and film and storytelling, we can now see a slightly more commercial generation coming after that.
Yes.
To me, you and David Hammonds are two pillars of this kind of incredible structure that has opened the path for many younger artists. So it was a pleasure to hear that, the suitcase metaphor, because we
Yes.
moved.
So how do you see that? I mean, from your vantage point, what does that mean? How am I a pillar for younger artists? I mean,
Oh, wow.
that?
Okay. How deep down the rabbit hole you want to go? All right. Okay, so in terms of African American art, there's certain issues, to me at least, that I think a lot of people have focused. In fact, one could argue, if you walk through any Chelsea gallery right now, it's this kind of trendiness for Black culture at every level, mostly figurative art, that kind of Thelma Golden Studio Museum kind of approach. Totally cool, no problem. On the other hand, the more conceptual and more abstract stuff is always harder to place. It's like Sun Ra. It took 40 years for people to really get into him, for him to be trendy and cool, or et cetera, et cetera. And one thing I've always been very respectful of both you and David is you resist the normal. I mean, David is one of the most elusive and quirky, and he's his own dimension at this point. What you've done, at least to me, again, as someone I'm grandpa here for my generation, I'm 50, but I can't believe I'm 50. I mean, 20 years ago I was 30. Oh my God. I don't feel 50. Anybody out there, if you want to play tennis or go jogging, I can still hang. But it's kind of like the way African American art and conceptualism needed that sort of, for lack of a better word, sort of the vaccine boost, like to kind of get our immune systems up to speed, so to speak, with how hyper commercialized a lot of Black culture, whether you look at, hip hop and the sort of bling lifestyle or other things. So people needed that extra space to just get breathing room from the hyper commodification, get breathing room from, now even the first photographers to do cover of Vogue magazine, there was controversy because they had Kamala Harris recently and she was wearing casual, Converse shoes on the cover. I think it was Vogue. I can't remember which magazine, but her team was a little bit mad because she was made to look casual. And again, she's the first Black woman vice president. I can't imagine Kamala Harris without your work. You know what I mean? So there's places where to give people the strength to imagine a different possibility. That was what was necessary.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I think that I think that we do that. I mean, I think that my desire as an artist, my desire as a person, has been to participate in my field in such a way that I enlarge it. Like that was my desire, right? And not, through my own work as such, but rather through the ways in which I introduced other artists to the world. So, my earliest work, and the way that actually I became known was not necessarily initially through my own work. It was through the way in which I organized other artists around work, right? So I spent a long time going around the country interviewing other artists like Fong does through the rail, right? I interviewed all these artists, right? I had like 2 nickels to rub together and I jump on a bus or a plane or a train and go to Mississippi or to New York or to Atlanta with my little tape recorder and my camera, documenting what photographers had been working. What African American photographers had been working, what women photographers had been making. I started my own archive, and then I would go back to places like San Francisco and New York, and I'd get on the phone. I'm like 23 years old, right? And I'd call the Museum of Modern Art, or I'd call the San Francisco Museum and say, you know what? There's some really serious photographers, Black photographers that you absolutely need to know. And I've been doing interviews with them and I've been collecting materials of theirs, and I'd love to bring it to the museum. That was the way I started my work, right? By simply knowing what was the field, who was in the field. I knew that they had been silenced, right? There were no books, there were no publications, right? Maybe there were 1 or 2, books on women photographers in the library when I was at Cal Arts. I don't think there was any on any African American photographers. Maybe there was one on a Japanese photographer, but that was it. right? So I knew that I wanted to be involved in my field in a very critical, in a very dynamic way. And I continue doing that work now. So, you know, if I do something at the Guggenheim, I invite another 150 artists to participate with me through a series of, you know, convenings and conferences, concerts, talks, poetry, dance, right? Science and what that looks like. So I'm really interested in sort of broadening the field of working it and working the magic in the field and allowing people to really understand, you know, what is really happening in the field. So that when an institution tells me that they don't know, right? After I brought you like 150 some of the badass motherfucking artists that I know, then that's a problem, right? You know, it's so you know, I'm doing that. I did, you know, the history of violence a couple of years ago at the Park Avenue Armory. Another just breathtaking. It was like breathtaking. I mean, by the end of the day, by 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock that night, like nobody could sit down. Like everybody, it was like the room simply elevated, right? And finally, Jason Moran was closing us out with one of the most beautiful solos I believe I've ever heard, literally. And so that's my work. My work is caring about other artists, thinking about other artists. So now I'm preparing another very large convening for the Park Avenue Armory for this December. Hopefully we'll be able to work again and be together again. But it's taken me a year to fine tune who are all of the artists that are out there that I'm particularly interested in, that I need to hear from, because I want to understand their relationship to the field as it relates to photography, as it relates to film, poetry, plays, dance, literature, science, biology, right? So I'm constructing this thing.
Well, that thing is a social sculpture in a certain sense. I mean, you're pulling together a tremendous amount of other creatives, and there's a social generosity to that. I mean, a lot of economists now, because of the COVID economy, they're realizing, say, for example, what happened with Roosevelt's Works Progress Administration in the 30s, you know, that triggered an entire wave of the Harlem Renaissance because people finally had a platform. And to me, at least, what the work that you're doing by convening, I love that term convening, by the way, is creating these kinds of unexpected and hidden connections. And me and you did the collaboration when Theaster Gates had his project at the Armory a little while ago.
Yes. Yeah,
and
that was wonderful.
Yeah, it was wonderful. I mean, all sorts of people popped out of the woodwork. And I think that social sculpture process, whether it was Joseph Beuys on one hand or somebody like Namjoon Paik on the other, when you kind of triangulate to a different generation and the update, so to speak, you're that bridge. I mean, because I've seen quite a few different artists figure out on a social dynamic. Andy Warhol, one could call it like a psychic vampire. Like he loved to do photography of people and take their energy. You know, like if you, you know, and so a lot of people would say that if you were in one of his photographs, it was like, you know, in musicians' world, like if you're 27, people like Hendrix or Kurt Cobain, they all die at 27. You know, Janis Joplin. So you wouldn't necessarily want to be in a Warhol photograph because your energy would be gone. You know, so he would just kind of. But so his photography was a way of creating that kind of like your energy would be taken. And it was like he would hover over people. I'm sure you've seen his social process and the factory. But the update is like that generosity of spirit, which I think you have. It's life affirming. It's a different. And I think it's a powerful statement on the generosity of art to build bridges between cultures. So
I think I think that's so right, Paul. I just can't like imagine another way of being, even when I'm, you know, zipped out, zapped out, and exhausted. You know, I still sort of return to this sort of platform that I'm very much interested in the context in which we live and seeing culture in context. And the only way that you can really do that, or at least that I feel that I can most genuinely do that, is to really sort of unpack these very, very, very specific genres in relationship to one another? What are the dots that are connecting us, right? What are the threads that are connecting us? And how are those threads being made, and how are they being built? And then how are they being maintained? And so, to the extent then that, maybe I've become now older and a kind of pillar, if you will. I understand that. I understand that I am older, that I'm viewed in a certain kind of way by a younger generation, that they absolutely see me as someone who's been able to widen the path so that it makes their work slightly easier, so that they can go off in other kinds of directions, right? So, I was one of the first ones through the door. So, I have certain kind of bruises.
But yeah, that's what I'm saying. That social generosity and creating, like, the reason I was using that sort of architectural metaphors, like when I say you and David are these two pillars, is that's how we make new buildings, how we think about new spaces in the culture. So do you want to, I mean, because I know there's a very eager audience, and it's Malvika, how time-wise, I want to be very respectful of Carrie's time. How do you guys feel about, because we've gone, she initially said 1:30 and we're cool for that hour. But do you guys still have, I can ask maybe one or two more questions and open it up, considering the time frame, and the poet, Joy, I want to make sure we get her time and everybody.
And I would love to hear Joy read as well.
How do you guys want to, this is a little bit democracy intervenes here. How do you want to flow here? I'm totally cool with that. I could ask Carrie questions until the stars fall.
Carrie, how do you feel about maybe one more question to close, and then we move to Joy? Does that sound okay?
All right, here's a burning question I've had for you for many years. It's like the psychology that I think generates a lot of your work comes out of this, the Black experience as it's been lived, but also that storytelling, the woman traveler, in medieval or ancient times, they would call it a flaneur, someone who goes to different cities, tells stories, gathers people around that story. And in your work, it seems like, this is my own personal interpretation, it seems like you're moving more and more towards these sort of convenings. Do you feel in the near future, is there any effects of social media, technologies, other kind of technologies that inform your process, or are you going to be sticking more to these kind of social spaces, just out of curiosity, and like the materials are changing?
But I'm sort of thinking about that right now. I'm not really sure. I mean, I think, I have there are some things that I'm interested in doing with technology. I think that I'm sort of interested in experimenting with a little bit, and thinking about maybe doing some stuff around podcast, thinking about doing maybe some animation. But for the most part, Paul, most part, when I put together like convening, I say to people, depending on, who they are, like maybe you have like half an hour, maybe you have like, 15 minutes, or maybe you have 10 minutes, right? And like sort of structure. And then I thought, singers sing. And some of the world's greatest songs have been done in 3 minutes.
Right.
So I sort of figure that if you're really on the case, right, 10 minutes is really a long time. Right? An hour is a massive amount of time. But I think that what I'm really learning, and I'd love to hear you also speak to this, Paul, and even Joy, you can speak to this as well. What is your lane? Right? What is your lane? So I'm interested in a whole bunch of stuff, right? I'm interested in many, many different things, interested in, sort of new technologies, interested in film, in video, in language, in dance, in music, interested in all of those things, and seriously so, right? But I do only just a few things really well, right? I only do a couple of things really, 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 really well. And right now, my sense is that that I really want to spin ever more deeply into the thing that I do actually best, right? That I've got like a limited time on the planet, If I'm lucky, maybe I've got like another 10, 20 years. So I really want to spend my time in the deep, really traveling in the deep, in the depths of the work, and doing that thing that I'm absolutely best at. And that alone is sort of opening up these sort of wonderful vistas for understanding and contemplation. And it's, it's also a little scary too, right? Because it's really scary to really, when you have to just like take off all your shit, right? And really look at who you are. It's a little scary, because we're all flawed. To sort of unpack those flaws and then to be able to unpack them in relationship to the work, to bring all of that discomfort, I think, to the work is really where authenticity really lies, right? When you've decided that there is nothing perfect in this world, and certainly not you, right? That you are, the perfect reflection of imperfection. That's what you are, right? And bringing that to the work, then I think is the task and is the joy that you have finally really sort of ripped down the veil and you can really see with clarity, and therefore with a certain kind of love, and therefore with a certain kind of hope, even within all your suffering. Something else begins to shine through that I think is really powerful. And so I'm sort of curious about that in relationship to your practice, your music, the ways in which you're working contemporarily. And then I would love to then switch to Joy and to hear her talk about that before she reads.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's a really powerful moment. I mean, I actually, just to get, because I've been thinking about your work so much, getting here for the interview. So this is making me rethink some stuff here. Amusing enough, when you say what lane are we in, or what I'm thinking about, I'm actually thinking right now mostly about the near edge extinction of our species, because we've been over consuming, we're putting pollution, plastics, the virus is actually, one could argue, a nature's reflection of all the human destabilizing of all the different biome systems and, the collapse of different ecosystems. So whether it came from a bat or weird market in China or whatever, it's mainly because of humans' disruption of nature's patterns. Mm-hmm. So those are things that are going to be just howling through the system over the next several. I mean, the forest fires last summer. I'm a regular jogger, and I was jogging in the mountains in Aspen during the summer. I was there the only reason I came back to New York is I had to switch my studio out and I'm doing some stuff. So I came back because I was like, oh, I don't want to mess with the city for a while, just because like right. I needed it, so, but the ashes of the trees, some of the largest forest fires in human history just happened last summer. Exactly. And the impact of things like colonialism, of the legacy of our bodies absorbing these into our, the ashes get into your lungs. The virus itself isn't geared for our lungs, all sorts of stuff. It was like that summer, and then the George Floyd phrase, I can't breathe. So many of those things, for me as somebody, I'm a futurist, I'm a technologist, I'm someone who's very interested in the human impact of things. So amazingly enough, it just seems like there's enough, I flew back to vote as well, and I really wanted to make sure. I probably should have voted in Colorado because it's a little bit more that red state, blue state, purple. But New York was blue. I mean, but to go to the heart of the issue was like, I think Trump's idea triggered me to think about the nihilism of the certain aspects of the American experience. This sort of entitlement to the edge of extinction. Like its people are just so in the middle of, on one hand, a total lack of awareness. Like, there's a very famous phrase in mathematics called the Lorentz effect, which is called the butterfly. Like the wings of a butterfly can trigger a hurricane on the other side of the planet. But we're making those kind of decisions and small, unstable choices every day that trigger larger scale impacts. So those are things that I think about in math and music and more of the science approach. That's kind of my lane. Yes. Have been important for making me think about the empathy that holds us all together. Because sometimes I have to admit, the last year, and this is where your work was inspiring, you felt like when those stupid Trump conferences, he was talking about the virus is going to go away, inject bleach. There was another one. He's like, oh yeah, it'll go away because we're going to blast it with some sunlight or something. And you just felt like, oh my God, we're at the peak of human civilization with high tech, all sorts of stuff, and this lunatic is running around. And you know, when Biden won, I had to admit this weight left my shoulders. I have to admit there was this. I couldn't. It was the best thing that happened last year was banning Trump from all social media. Personally, that was like a real pleasure. But you know, at the moment, I'm kind of regrouping and rebooting because I've been thinking a lot more about how our species is going to get through the next century, because it just seems
Might not.
yeah, it really. And I know that sounds like a downer. I hope that I don't.
I mean, you know, I'd love to
Yeah.
talk more about this. I know that, you know, you've been really in this world, really looking at the environmental impacts for a while now, you know, 10, 15 years you've been, and I've been sort of looking at this as well, and sort of using sort of metaphorical references to it. But I'm not really sure. I don't know if we have the capacity to make it, because we don't have, you know, the capacity to, you know, to really fully embrace our humanness in relationship to the world around us. You know, capitalism, and you know, has you know, is running, you know, roughshod over the planet, and it has no intention of giving up its power. It has no intention of doing it. So we are, you know, in this time warp, you know, with these with a system that no longer works, but it insists that it does, right? You know, and so how people then will respond to this, you know, it can be too late. We know, and all the scientists around the world knows that, the temperature is just edging up, right? You know, we haven't had any rain, we haven't had any snow, right? I live in Syracuse, New York. I have like a dusting of snow. Do you know what I mean? You know, I mean, around the world, you know, the cherry blossoms, you know, just, you know, completely, just broke open in Japan. It's the first time in recorded history, right?
Yep.
Since they've tracked them, that you know, the blossoms have come and gone so quickly. So we are in something that our power is not willing to let up on. And so whether or not we survive will depend on, you know, our ability to really understand the truth, and then figure out ways of developing new systems by which to live, and hopefully it won't be too late.
And that's where art, especially that's where I think your art is, that what I was saying earlier, like sort of life affirming. There's a lot of very negative, you know, Marx would call it a negative dialectic, like where there's a very famous phrase where him and Engels were saying all that is solid melts into air. Well, we're already there. I mean, the whole, you know, dematerialization and you know, everything from fiber optic cables, satellite frequencies. Your average person interacts more with their cell phone than with the people around them.
Right.
You know, and the pandemic kind of made that more entrenched, because like you were just saying, capitalism alone, the sheer volume of economics that was transferred just in the last year. You know, so the Green New Deal, which is, I'm a big fan of, you know, AOC and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. That still comes out of the arts. So don't forget, the New Deal helped trigger art to help reboot the society. With FDR during the Great Depression, the New Deal, which is what everyone is sort of rethinking. And we need to, anyway, these are all things that when I was looking at your convenings and sort of the resist COVID stuff, it was, again, very life affirming and sort of enheartening. I guess is that a term, enheartening, you know, instead of disheartening?
You know, I'll send my list. I've been working on this list for like the last 7-8 months of the people that I really wanted to hear from next December. I think it's pretty much finalized now. I'd love to send it to you for your response. So maybe we have about 200 people on the list, and it'll be maybe a 14-day staggered kind of experience. I think that's going to be kind of wonderful, with concerts sort of woven throughout the entire sequence of things. But yeah, thank you so much, Paul, for inviting me to be with you. And now Joy's going to talk just a little bit about her process before she leaves.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in the dialogue. just without being prepared to speak outside of poetry, processually, I think I don't know yet. I've had one major project so far, and I think that for me, it feels like process might be attached to individual projects. Right now, though, I'm very, very concerned with other disciplines, particularly Black people working in other disciplines and being in conversation with those disciplines, and how I can be in conversation with those other disciplines through poetry. I work a lot in the ekphrasis, which is, poetry written after other pieces of art, other projects and other genres, particularly with film. I've been working a lot with Black film, writing poems in conversation with Black films. So, and very recently, the direction I think my next project is going in is a kind of organization around these other disciplines. How I can be in conversation with anything from, geology, history, dance, linguistics, and all of these sort of like thinking about Blackness in conversation with these different disciplines. So I don't know if that's helpful, but as a poet, I always say like I'm a poet because I grew up poor. I could have maybe been a filmmaker or something, but a lot of us, it's just a joke really. But if I could play an instrument, I would probably be a musician. That's my favorite.
Oh yeah? What kind of a musician? What would you do?
Well, I'm trying to teach myself the bass guitar right now. And I actually have a poem about that. But I really appreciated your playlist because music is like how I get into the actual act of writing. And Alice Coltrane and Frank Ocean is definitely on my playlist.
Yes.
Part of that, I like to put music on just a song on repeat. Like I might play the same song for 2 hours to like really get into, because once I'm locked into that sort of tone, like I don't want to get out of it because it'll change the tone of whatever I'm working on. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you experienced that.
Yes, I think it's interesting, right? You sort of use it as a sort of to create a habitat in which to live, right? And so I completely understand. And where are you? Where are you based? Are you in New York?
I'm actually in Houston, Texas. Okay. So I just experienced just at the end of our conversation just now, I would just want to say I just experienced the power water crisis here, because a state doesn't have the infrastructure to deal with temperatures dropping below 32 degrees, because it doesn't happen ever here. Mm-hmm. And suddenly it's happened and we lost power for a week and water for a little bit longer. So something's definitely going on with that. A combination of, like you all discussed, ecological circumstances, but also, political decisions played a role. So it's, sort of the how one exacerbates the other. But I can read some ecological bass guitar poems.
The floor is yours.
Yeah, it's all you and Carrie. I'm here just in chill out mode. It's great.
If it's all right, I can read your little bio ahead of time if you'd like. But I will say Joy Priest is one of those people whose reputation precedes her. Maybe needs no introduction, but I will say she's the author of Horsepower, which came out with Pitt Poetry Series just last year and was selected by the U.S. Poet Laureate Natasha Trethewey as the winner for the Donald Hall Prize for Poetry. And she's the recipient of a 2021 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, among so many others. And Joy, I love you, but I feel like the last time we had Joy Priest on, it was for a conversation about progressive grassroots candidates sort of breaking in new blood into Congress, and she planted the seed in me, which was, she said, like, every time you think about the Walter Benjamin, the angel of history and what is progress and what is the wreckage, you see like the original catastrophe of Benjamin's angel of history as colonialism, extractive like logics, and like the afterlife of chattel slavery, and like that we're all still living in it, and that's the wreckage. And I feel like so many of our conversations have come right out of that. So Joy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Malvika. I'm gonna start with all my mothers. All my mothers live in an alley at the back of a lawmaker's mind. A mind with no imagination for our reality, they say, with teeth rolled like cigarettes factories. Still, my mother sweat through a week of soil on their skin, unconcerned with grace. One has grace and a gold tooth, a tiny heart etched in the middle. One knows a key ingredient of beauty is sorrow. Oven burns cross the wrist, fingers callous from hot plates. My mother's Marcel curl every Sunday in the alto section, her tired face holding down the tenor of a precarious song. I have many mothers, you see, some gone on, but still sitting at the bus stop as their half-life selves waiting on the city to carry them to work. The jealous mourning dove holding territory above the shelter taunts my mothers. One calls him worrisome. One has no insurance and a persistent cough sitting in the back of a doctor's mind. She says he has no imagination to offer, no way out of no way. She hopes that doctor knows there is no way to distance ourselves in a one-room house. My mother think these well-to-dos ain't too well. The second poem I want to read is in conversation with the work of the scholar Christina Sharp. So it contains lines from her book In the Wake, which is a book around the afterlife of slavery and its extractive logics. Ghost in schools. A human body would not make it to the seafloor intact. No loitering in the water. They whisper like fish, the police in schools like fish, the atoms of the people who were thrown overboard. Sometimes my lungs feel like stones in the hypnagogic hour, that watery room between wakefulness and sleep. The faint formation of land in the distance, that's when horror struck in the mind of the African above deck, the moment just before our African became American. Out there in the ocean even today, hidden in the language, in the pelagic tunnels, narrow corridor of attention, fish whisper. They avoid our shadows like fish, ghost in schools like fish, police in schools. No loitering in our history. We talk like fossils in this country. The amount of time it takes for a substance to enter the ocean and then leave the ocean is called residence time. Those who took the ocean as their home murmurous as my footsteps. Standing midnight at the Atlantic harbor, I hear the fishermen yelling to one another out on the water, where they've just noticed the sea beginning to part. A corridor of murdered Africans, million ghosts marching to Wall Street. We were always white folks' white whale. Ain't that some shit? Black Outside. I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, and I really appreciate Malvika's introduction and acknowledgement of Breonna Taylor, and particularly how it was connected to, some larger, more insidious issues in our city, a city that's oftentimes not a part of the national imagination, but perhaps one of the most segregated cities in the country. And so that's allowed a particular social organization that is, really deadly for the people in the neighborhood where I come from in West Louisville. And this is a poem about gentrification, but it's also in conversation with geology. It's also in conversation with geography. It's in conversation with Black scholarship and so forth, as we were talking about earlier, how we can use our particular genre to be in conversation with other genres. And it's called The Black Outside. There's an epigraph, and it is, "The enclosure is so brutal," Sadia Hartman. The jazz puts you on a swing in your project neighborhood, where you learn the antithesis of ownership, where you learn to live with the loudness of your neighbor's living. It brings an ecology of sincerity, the thought of the Black outside. And you believe that shit. You believe the hollowed out trunks, the treehouse of our speech, the way we say things. Had to quit carrying on with folks who don't have a history of being hidden or community plumbing issues. Done with jazzless folks who ask why you still have feelings. You're being wayward with us now in the Black outside. The jazz puts you on a swing in the gentry's neighborhood, which used to be your neighborhood, where you pinned your personality on a shared clothesline, where you placed your speaker in the courtyard window to bring us out, on a swivel now in the bureaucratic fabric, on a walk you've taken to escape, the mind so close to itself it cannot see itself, like the eyes above the nose. What doesn't pursue you now? You are even after yourself. On that walk all the way to Wall and back down, worrying about the way you looked, feeling unstable on the inside, you wrote from above yourself. And on at Van Buren, when you turned back toward Montrose Boulevard, there it was, an Olive Buick stalled in the median. And suddenly you were in the Black outside. Dear beloved in the future, are you still maroon? Lover, are you there? Am I there too? And I can do one more or two more, but I'll just do the bass guitar poem. It's called Bass. And while as I'm teaching myself, the strings of the bass are E, A, D, G. And so one of the mnemonics for that is Eva ate dynamite good. And I just really, that was just great. That was really gnarly to me. So I was like, I'm gonna just riff off this line, as one does when they're learning their way around the board. Bass. Eva ate dynamite good, like a tear gas brigade on a runaway night. Her genre, Black Meadow. Her sound, maroon. Her imitators pale as any clout in the versal world. Eva already done got down. Eva already done got it worked out, like a remedy for terror in our new carceral courtyard. My favorite little agitator, my pluck, my thread of mine. Eva ain't dim gas. Eva ain't devil, ain't dust, always dropping goods. Eva always grieving drums. Eva ate dynamite good. Eva armed defense garland, departed genealogy, escort, sliding notes, paraffin, fret fingers. Eva ate doggone. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
Wow.
you so much.
By the way, Joy, I play bass, so you can, if you can't, one thing I would love to suggest, if you want to learn a fun way to get started is, do you have an instrument, by the way, or is it just hypothetical right now? Just out of curiosity.
I have a guitar and an amp, yeah.
Okay, it's to play along with old reggae songs. They usually have more simple bass lines. So you can practice really, and it's a good way to get started. Just a little pro tip. But it's that was beautiful. And by the way, we have some great people in the audience. I see Tomashi, she has an exhibition coming up. There's a whole bunch of young, amazing women artists in the audience. So thank you for that. Yeah. There's everybody's saying, hey. So Malvika, do you want to, Carrie, this could go.
Let's do it.
This is cool.
Well, what I would love to do, first off, thank you so much, Joy. I adore you. Thank you, Paul, and Miss Weems had to jump off. But I feel like we still have her energy just all around us. And of course, thank you to all of you who tuned in the audience and in the chat. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a special guest, our publisher and artistic director and the captain of this very fine vessel, Fong Bui, who will read our closing statements. And Fong, you should be able to turn on your microphone whenever you'd like. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the settings so that everyone can kind of unmute at will. And we can all kind of chit-chat back and forth a little. But Fong, passing it over to you.
Thank you so much. I think Carrie had something of an appointment to tend to, so therefore she's no longer with us. I think she just left us. But thank you, Paul, for carrying a very important conversation with Carrie. I think that if we can open a quick Q&A, I think we can talk among ourselves about Carrie's work, and I couldn't more agree deeply with Paul's observation. I think for me, when I first saw Carrie's work, it reminded me so much of the classic book by Peter Brook. It's called The Empty Space. That was 1968. It really essentially began with a person, an actor, walking on the stage while an audience is observing the actor. That's the content. The book is essentially went on to, you know, propose so many questions, how many things you can strip away, lighting, backdrop, and so on. So essentially it's about an act and an observer, an actor and observer. And I think there's something about that essential, essential element in Carrie's work that have to do so much with what she just confessed to us. She have a huge monumental ego, but she makes sure that it's completely disassociated when she make the works. And it's very interesting to me because that's a matter of scale. Huge ego, but makes small work. Very interesting. I think her work is more about the persistent on silence, than rather than noise and big size. I mean, so much of it. You talk about luxurialism, Paul. I couldn't help but to bring up Gregory Crewson's work. The big prop and huge scale photography, even bigger is the work of Andrei Gursky. So compared to the perception of scale, you can make small work that have monumental scale. And you can make big work that have intimacy or not at all the scale of the monumentality. So there's something about her work compels me so much, and it makes sense that it had to do with content. I think the setting in the work is all about content. So the ongoing relationship with Carrie to many of her artist friends make perfect sense to me. It's really political activism being super quiet through that format of her black and white, relatively modest scale photography. So that's all I have to say. I have more to say. That's what made me wanted to interview. But I'm glad you are doing it, Paul.
Okay, well, yeah, I mean, we have some great people in the audience, and I want to just personally, I mean, it's a real pleasure. These are very weird, cynical times, and it's like post QAnon, post Trump. I just want a palate cleanser, like to kind of sweep all that garbage away. And so, some of the poetry that we've encountered, some of the visual arts. It's a pleasure that a whole bunch of people are in the audience that are friends of mine, and just
Yes.
Man, and by the way, I want to just suggest everybody, don't forget to get vaccinated. Don't do some anti-science stuff, So yeah, I mean, this is very real, crazy stuff going on. So yeah, thank you so much for the poem, Joy, and Fong always. I mean, how Malvi, do you guys? I mean, people can ask questions. They can riff.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I want to be perfectly transparent. If people have lunch dates or work they have to get back to, don't feel free. But I'm happy to hang out here, and it seems that quite a few people are as well. So maybe if Paul, you want to open it up with a question, if anyone has something they want to say.
Sure. Tamashi, I see Tamashi on her phone. Hey, can you unmute her? Like, Tamashi, you have an exhibition coming up of some of your art, looking at the history of certain regions. And if you guys aren't familiar with Tamashi's work, amazing artist. And just like Tamashi, could you want to riff on what Carrie was riffing about, like history, women, photography, archival? These are all things that resonate with your work too.
Yeah, for sure. I was thinking a lot about well, thank you everyone. Number one, Joy, thank you so much. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Carrie, and everyone who made this possible. I was thinking a lot about enlargement through embracing and uplifting other people's stories, and that being a part of the work. I have these thoughts about a robust and productive creative practice being cyclical in its nature, but like naturally cyclical. So like there's a time there's a time for solo work, and there's a time for collective work. There's a time for for me, there's a time for making murals, you know, like there's a time for publicness that everyone can have access to somehow. And now I also understand that that includes publication. Like ways, there are ways and strategies to make work available, and there are times for pushing out and absorption. So yeah, so I really liked that. The way she talked about her focus being enlarging the field itself by going around and putting herself in places to observe and absorb and value, to facilitate the value of engagement, to see the less seen and make it more seen for others. That generosity being a huge key, and being that during the pivot, my Radcliffe Institute project that I'm working on turned into a publication because we couldn't bring people here to facilitate teach-ins. Oh, the part where she's talking about, well, I guess it happens a lot, where she's talking about the connections between fields, the interconnectivity between realms of subjectivity. I think of these as all markers of public space. Policy being like the public space that governs us all, whether or not we recognize it or not. So I really appreciated that, and that she kept coming up to dance. That was interesting too. That dance and language, the body, one's own body, the bodies of others, music, science, that all of those places are, that she's looking for interconnectivity in those places. So I relate to that. Yeah, the project that Paul is talking about is called The Land Claim. It's another postponed solo show that's happening at the Parish Museum that'll be opening in July, I think. And that work focuses on creating and expanding an archive of narratives of BIPOC experiences on Long Island. So that's the Shinnecock Nation, Black people who've been there for, I'll have to look at my notes, but the generations of Black people who have been there, and the contemporary labor force that is primary Latinx. So yeah, this whole thing, everything that you all have been talking about left me, or maybe this is just what's on my mind, that the matter of ethical stewardship, the matter of ethical stewardship when it comes to observing, facilitating, and valuing the narratives of other people. When that's a part of one's work, how are ethics facilitated? How is care considered? How is trust maintained when you are holding this precious thing that is the oral or visual history of someone else? Yeah, you all have me writing in my notes like I'm back in school, so thank you for this.
All right.
Mashi, we love it so much. Thank you so much for your contribution. And if you could drop a chat to that upcoming work, we'd love to have it.
Yeah, and I'll nudge that conversation forward. In fact, Tamashi, you've given me an inspiration. I'll text you about it, but Fong, I'll circle back to that too, because there could be some additional sort of vectors of that. I have to run because I have an appointment, and so this one. But if everybody's cool, thank you guys so much for tuning in. And Carrie is a national treasure. It's really important that I think that we can all hear these people's thought process. The last one, I mean, I don't know if everybody got a chance to hear the conversation I had with Ai Weiwei, where he was talking about being, you know, re-indoctrinated in Xinjiang, picking cotton. With that one, that still blows my mind. I can't believe. But now there's this huge controversy in China about the cotton. I don't know if anybody's been following that. A lot of American brands have been subtly or secretly using labor from these places, and then you know, Apple, your iPhone, and your cotton socks, and all sorts of stuff are being made by, you know, very problematic situations. And it was refreshing from Ai Weiwei's cotton experience to pivot over to Carrie Mae Weems. She just casually told Wynton Marsalis, "Oh, have the Lincoln, you know, Center Jazz Orchestra played like one of your pieces in my art." And so I love stuff like that. But I'm starving. I got to go to this appointment. So
yeah.
If there's any follow-up, Carrie's on social media. Her Twitter is Weems. Melvie, you can probably text that. And I'll be happy to retweet it. My Twitter is @DJ Spooky. If she doesn't get back, I'll nudge her and remind. But I got to blast out. All right.
Blast
Bye, everybody.
out.
All right.
Thank you all
Right.
for dropping in. I will say we're celebrating the Rail's 20th anniversary this year. So as a nonprofit organization, if you enjoyed today's program, please consider making a donation to keep the Rail and our special projects. This event included free, relevant, and interesting, independent, always interesting. And please join us again tomorrow when we're joined by artist Federico Solmi and curator, educator, and Rail editor at large, Dan Cameron. That will be, as always, at 1 p.m. right here in the Zoom. You can all turn on your microphones if you'd like to say goodbye as you leave. But this has truly been such a blessing. So lovely to see you all there.
Bye.
Goodness. All right.
Thanks,
good
Joy.
afternoon.
Everything was fabulous. Really, really.
Thank you so much for the
Really
poetry
great.
and everything.
Thank you,
Thank
Joy.
you so much.
Such a treat.
Fantastic. Thank you.